Well, some news just coming in. We've been looking at the visit of the U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken, the focus of the U.S. Leaders, among other things, on freedom, equality, human rights. What exactly is that message all about? Well, he's met Prime Minister Modi, and there's a statement from the External Affairs Ministry on what the Prime Minister has had to say. The statement says, Prime Minister Modi said that the societies of the U.S. and India share a deep commitment to the values of democracy, freedom and liberty, and the Indian diaspora in the US has contributed immensely to the enhancement of bilateral ties. So that's India's response to repeated messages from the United States on the need for India to preserve, and for the United States, the bedrock of their relationship: human rights, democracy, democratic institutions, the election process, etc., etc. Well, joining us now, Dr. A.K. Merchant. He's the National Trustee cum Secretary of the Lotus Temple. He was one of the civil society leaders invited by Mr. Blinken to be a part of that roundtable this morning, where human rights and other issues were looked at very closely. Also joined by Ghanshyam Tiwari of the Samajwadi Party. Let me come across to you, Dr. A.K. Merchant. What were some of the questions that Antony Blinken asked the roundtable panelists?
Yeah, one correction. I'm not the secretary. I'm a national trustee, and I'm the general secretary.
Right.
Of the
So could you answer the question, sir, on
yes,
what happened over there?
The question is, our focus was on inclusive development. So he wanted to know how in India, in this during this period of pandemic, we have managed to provide for inclusive development. And as you know, the government of India has done a lot for the poorest of the poor, the last mile. The last person in this process of requiring assistance, rations, medical supplies, etc., etc. So his main concern was how also members of different religious communities or within the interfaith movement context, because India is a multicultural, multilingual, multi-religious society. So he invited just a select 6 or 7 of us to have this one-to-one dialogue. And each one, they contributed and shared what each community had been doing, and how collectively also they had been pooling certain amount of resources and trying to support the initiative and the endeavors of the government for whatever they were doing for the citizens of the country. So in that context, I mentioned how many of the interfaith movement communities had been involved, as well as what the Baha'i community also had done. Because right from the guidance we received from our Supreme Governing Council last year, communities at the local, state, regional and the national levels have been contributing to the welfare of the people, the most needy ones.
Right.
And
so, Dr. Merchant, was there no conversation on human rights in India? Was there no conversation on preserving democratic institutions? On the way laws had been used in the recent past in the country, for example, on sedition, the entire issue of dissent? Did any of that come up?
What came up was our shared democratic values.
Were there specific examples of concerns which any of you may have had, or which the US leader may have had?
In terms of the shared democratic values, it was mentioned that both countries have their own challenges. And we, as members of different religious communities, we try to stay free from the political issues. We said that you have called us for discussing inclusive development, so let's focus on that.
Were there any specific concerns which were raised?
There were comments about changing scenario, but most of our discussions were all about values, all about how these two countries have got a long-standing relationship.
So by changing scenario, what do you mean, Dr. Merchant? What was the conversation on changing scenarios?
Well, changing scenario as a result of this pandemic.
Right.
Like, for instance, policies relating to supply of vaccines.
Right. There was no overt mention or discussion by anyone, Dr. Merchant, on human rights concerns and specific examples of that in India in the entire meeting which took place?
No, there was nothing about human rights as such. There was just one mention that to an extent, freedom of the press might have been affected because of these fake news. which is, of course, obviously a general concern. But as far as the other matters are concerned, we did not focus.
Okay.
We were more concerned with the spiritual context
Got it.
and the religious community's contribution.
Let me go across to Ghanshyam Tiwari. Mr. Tiwari, how do you see this visit and the fact that in as much as, we've discussed Quad and Afghanistan and all of that, which we've been doing for a while, there was this overt mention of democracy. It's something we've taken for granted in the past. It's not something that's come up in as big a manner, right, at least publicly. Does that surprise you?
Well, good evening to you, to your viewers and my fellow co-panelists. I think three things stand out very clearly. One is the US really taking a new line compared to what a Trump administration would have done. And definitely this is a visit in the backdrop of how the Indian Prime Minister participated and thought that his popularity in India and US has a bearing on the US elections. So the shadow of Ab Ki Baar Trump Sarkar should not be missed. That said, US is cautious that at the world stage, India is an important participant and Prime Minister Modi is a very visible leader. So, them just mentioning that they would make human rights a part of discussion is a direction to the Modi administration that the Trump line is not what will be celebrated with the Biden administration. My final point is, forever India will look at diversity, freedom, liberty, our democracy, harmony as a way of competitive power across the world. It's our soft power. Our democracy is our strength, our diversity is our strength. That is how the world wants to engage with us. And every time that is diminished, there will be forces in the world who would want India not to diminish.
Right.
So I think the message is very clear that India must take its competitive strength more seriously than it is taking.
Mr. Srinivas, would you agree that it's time for the government to realize that they're dealing with a very different kettle of fish as compared to the Trump administration, one that prioritizes democracy and human rights perhaps more than what the Trump administration did?
Vishnu, I will go with the statement what Dr. S. Jaishankarji has given already. He's already said that we have strong convergence on the views on many regional concerns and work closely on multilateral global issues. This in crux tells about everything. What happened in the entire meeting?
All right. So that's you'll refer to that statement of the foreign minister. I'll run short of time on this discussion. Important references to a plethora of issues linked to human rights over here. But I think the point that was mentioned is that the way in which it was mentioned was not to look down on India or to give directions, but to suggest that India and the United States both needed to strengthen their democratic institutions and processes.